When I talk with people about acetaminophen and the risk of autism, there's usually two responses. So the first response, and this is more in the generation of the parents, is they're open to and grateful for that information, and they're more the generation realizing the risks with medications and overuse of medications and wanting to be more natural. But then with the grandparents, sometimes the thinking is more, well, I gave my kids Tylenol and they're fine, therefore Tylenol cannot be, a major factor contributing to autism or the autism epidemic. So what we see there is this kind of, false dichotomy in terms of expecting a very all or nothing outcome with an exposure. And we tend to have this type of black and white thinking sometimes, that it either does or does not always. But the fact of the matter is that there's many different inputs, and any one input is going to increase or decrease all these other factors that are all connected with all these other factors, and then ultimately you get the outcome. So it's not like a light switch, being off or on. It's much more multifactorial. But let's try to get away from that black and white thinking. So let's consider two examples. So one, let's consider use of a seatbelt. So we would say not wearing a seatbelt in a car is a major risk factor for dying in a car accident. Now, we would disagree with somebody saying, oh, well, I didn't wear a seatbelt this morning and I didn't die, so therefore it is not a major risk factor. We would say, oh, well, that was just one exposure or one incident. But if you look at repeated exposures, the more and more driving instances without a seatbelt, the more and more risk. We would also say, well, there's all these other factors, right? How fast was traffic? How much congestion was there? Were there drunk drivers? Were there distracted drivers? So again, you have these two factors. One, what's the repetition of exposure? And two, what are the other risk factors? Now let's look at another example. Let's look at unhealthy diets and obesity. We would say that an unhealthy diet is a major risk factor for being obese, even though you could eat unhealthy from time to time and not be obese. But again, with repeated exposure, there's more and more risk. And there's also other factors with that as well, right? So how much is a person exercising? What are their genetics? How hungry are they? So for instance, what's not just the quantity of food, but the quality of food? And that can be affected by chronic stress or sleep deprivation. Those both increase hunger. But again, we wouldn't say, oh, well, an unhealthy diet is not the main factor, since you can have one without the other. And same thing with acetaminophen. Acetaminophen being the active ingredient in Tylenol and generic infant fever reducers, at least if they're labeled less than 6 months, that's what the active ingredient is. Such as Little Remedies, infant fever and pain reliever. It's the same medication, acetaminophen. So you look at the history of the autism epidemic, and there was basically, you start with that increase in 1980, which is when the CDC came out with their warning about the connection with aspirin and Reyes syndrome. So that's when you start seeing aspirin being replaced by Tylenol as the medicine of choice for infant fever reduction. So yes, there are other risk factors for autism, but Tylenol seems to be a key player, whether that's lowering the threshold for autism or amplifying the negative effects of all the other risk factors.